On behalf of the committee, we're thankful for the opportunity to serve on this committee, and we're thankful for the chance to be done. So,
well, Brad and Dick and the other members of the committee, thank you for doing this. Your work has really far exceeded my expectations. Gave a lot of thought into who I asked to be on the committee. I wanted a really diverse group of backgrounds, but I also wanted to have individuals that I knew would give this subject matter the thought and the work that it really needed. And I think it is reflected really well in the report that you just handed to me. This committee has no authority. Their charge was simply to look into what the root causes are of a decline in voter confidence and make recommendations based on the input that they had. And they went out and they sought input, first of all, from a pretty diverse group of experts, where they were pollsters, academics, party chairs, but people that really had some insight on the topic of voter confidence. And then on top of that, they reached out to the general public and just listened. And I cannot tell you how impressed I was, both at the committee for having the patience to listen, but also the general public came forward and really expressed the concerns that they had in different ways. And I think that there was a lot to take away from that really tremendous input. And then I really appreciated the way that you took the information and discussed it among yourselves in a really respectful, collegial way. And I think that those two phases of this, the public input and the expert input, coupled with your ability to look beyond your own ideological differences and discuss the information and put it together in a package is, as Chairman Cook mentioned, I think a model for others to follow. And I hope that we can continue this trend in the state of New Hampshire, both by having other sounding boards like this, but also the legislature taking the information that you provided and having some really good discussions about the direction from a policy perspective that we should take on addressing these items. As far as the content in the report, there's nothing in there that surprises me. I think the committee really hit the necessary points. I was at most of the listening sessions, and so I heard the testimony myself personally, and I was able to take away my own information from that. But it all boils down, in my opinion, to two things. To maintain voter confidence, our election process has to be as transparent as it can possibly be, and we have to do a good job, a better job, at educating our voting population on just how our election system works and help them be made aware of all the checks and balances that are in play. And to the extent that the legislature can take steps to make things more transparent, I think that will go a long way to increasing confidence that the voting population has. And I'm really happy to say that based on some recent polling by the University of New Hampshire and others, we seem to have nudged the voter confidence bar up a tick, which maybe the result of this committee already. I'd like to think so. But anyway, I want to thank Dick and Brad for chairing the committee, and Jim and Ken, Randy, Doug, Andy, and Olivia for the really important work that you did. I can't tell you how much I really appreciate it, and I think that this is a real benefit to the state of New Hampshire and our elections moving forward. So I'm going to hand this back to you, Brad. So.
Thank you, David. Merry Christmas. So, Merry Christmas for us. We don't have any more meetings. The report speaks for itself, and it's a result, as you all know, because these meetings go open public, of public meetings and a lot of input It's very difficult to summarize a report and hit high points. I think the Secretary's remark about the recent polling and the recent confidence in elections. We wondered about the timing of this report, whether it should come out before an election or after an election. I think as it turned out, having it after the 2022 elections, where they were certainly run competently. There were a lot of recounts, there were appeals, there were hiccups that got corrected, but that sort of verified the ultimate thing that we found, which is twofold. When elections are run by our friends and neighbors, and I've said many times, when I walk into Ward 1 in Manchester and my next door neighbor asks me for my ID, I know the system's working because it still works. But also, when there are hiccups, there are corrective devices in it. New Hampshire elections are easy to vote in, accessible, get good turnout, and are human endeavors like any other human activity, and therefore they aren't perfect. And we had the input from people who had systemic concerns. We had people who were concerned that other people had concerns and wanted to reinforce their confidence in the elections. We had people point out specific errors and violations of procedure and law. And we had certain things that we were not equipped to investigate that we referred to the Attorney General's office. But all in all, I think our report says, I think we believe that New Hampshire elections are free of or free from any systemic fraud, that they are designed to do one thing. What are elections designed to do? Collect the people who get the most votes, or pass the resolutions that get the most support. And our elections do that. In the report, there are a number of recommendations on transparency, on education, on clarification, on access, but these are suggestions to improve the system. I know we both want to thank the many, many hundreds of people who came and communicated with us, each of whom was sincere and concerned about their democracy. And it's just been a very good process. And Dick's going to talk, and then we'll be glad to answer questions.
Thank you, Brad. I just want to make a couple of comments. Brad pretty much covered everything that I had intended to say, except for this one point, and that is that this report made every effort to include everyone's voice in it. And we have in the Exhibit A that expands upon the summaries of all of the testimony that was given and the suggestions that the public gave. It has in it both the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what we are hoping to have started is a conversation where those folks who are very concerned about how our elections are being run, number one, see that in 2022 and through the processes that we have established here in the state of New Hampshire, that we can run a fair and transparent election. But more importantly, we have begun an open dialogue, a public dialogue, where anyone who has concerns will be able to bring those concerns to the Secretary of State's office. I'm sure that we'll continue to hear from folks who have expressed their concerns, and most importantly, that these discussions will take place in a public square where everyone is respected, where everyone has the opportunity to state their position, and that hopefully we'll be able to garner a conversation that demonstrates higher confidence and greater transparency, and ultimately a continued improved election process. I would also like to say that as these things go forward, as we have these conversations, that we shouldn't forget what I think is the most important piece of information that came out of this, and we're hearing it in the news today even, with regard to what's going on in Arizona. Being involved locally in your elections is what makes your election safe and secure. If you don't know who's running your local elections, or if you are not personally involved in that election process, you are leaving open the opportunity for influences that are not from your community to try and control that election process. We're seeing that in the testimony that's being given in Arizona, that there were not those kinds of connections between the people running the elections and the people who were voting at that election, at that voting place. And so in New Hampshire, we don't do that. In New Hampshire, we elect our local officials. In New Hampshire, we participate. And it reminds me, and I think many of us who have served in public office can identify with what I'm about to say. It reminds me of when I was in Congress and someone would come up and they would complain about some piece of legislation or some other thing that the government was doing. And the first question I always asked them, respectfully but very seriously, I said, did you vote in your last election? And if they said no, I would say, well, you know, that makes what I'm about to hear you say to me a little bit more difficult to listen to, because you were not participating as a voter in your election process. And that's what I'm hearing when I talk to people about whether or not they're helping out at the local level in running those elections in the towns and in the cities in New Hampshire. So with that participation, we ensure our votes are secure. And it is my hope and prayer that everybody will take that seriously, and if you're not involved, get involved. If you are involved, continue to be, and if you see something, say something. It pertains to voting as much as it pertains to other aspects in our life. And in order for us to build the kind of confidence in our system, it's going to take not agreement across the board in the public square, but a respectful debate and then understanding of what is the best process for conducting our voting process. So thank you one and all for your service on the committee. It has been a real honor and pleasure to work on this important issue. I assume it's not going to go away. It's, as I said, it's the beginning of a continual conversation that I think will only redound to the benefit of our great state. Thank you. Any questions from the press? We'll be happy to take them at this time.
Must be Christmas.
It's like a town meeting. Yes, sir.
Sure, yeah, to talk about the legislature should review the body of election laws and make them less complex and be sure they are consistent. Did you hear about inconsistent laws that are confusing or getting in the way of action up to now?
I think the answer to that is we heard about the continual growth of the size of the election manual from election to election as the legislature adds to the body of law. And I know from another part of my life on the Ballot Law Commission that sometimes we have to balance one section against another section to see what it really means. And I think the intent of that recommendation was if this whole thing could be streamlined a little bit and reviewed to make sure that it's consistent, that would be helpful.
What was the most common concern that the public brought up?
I don't know if there was one that was the most common concern. I think we heard about checklist issues. We heard about students voting in college towns quite a bit. We heard about same-day registration concerns about possible abuse. We heard about reports of vote counting devices that didn't work. We heard a lot about the town of Windham. But I wouldn't say there was one most common concern. I think we heard a lot about individual town officials who didn't follow specific rules that didn't necessarily taint the elections, but could lessen confidence because there are certain rules that have to be followed.
I would also just like to add that one of the things that came through from my perspective was that voting officials at the local level need to treat the voters with respect, give them access, make them feel that, as they say in a free society, you know, that or in a free market, I should say, that the customer has the, you know, the controls the transaction. The voter should have that feeling of being able to see what the process is and feeling confident that their vote has been collected, secured, and counted. And those are the things that are most important. And anybody who doesn't feel that, we feel the system should be changed in order to give that sense. The other thing that I would add also is just the point that as one does participate in the electoral system, that the process be very transparent, be very obvious and very simple to understand. And I think that was one thing that Brad talked about earlier, is that we need to teach our young people about the voting process. And we need to continue to have that conversation with our neighbors and citizens so that there isn't any question. And then lastly, I would also add that the Attorney General's office, we forwarded a number of the complaints to the Attorney General's office, and it's my hope and expectation that they would not only take a look at them seriously and consider what has been said, but be able to do it in a manner that ensures that the public are being heard and that those questions that they raise are being answered to their satisfaction.
Can you give a sense of the things that you're recommending? What sort of share of them are things that the Secretary of State could implement on his own versus things that would require legislation?
And I think you make a very good point. First and foremost is that the Secretary of State is going to take this report and do with it as he chooses. So our recommendations are purely from a non-binding and lack of authority committee that has reviewed the testimony that we've received. As we've said, I think that the concerns are transparency, the concerns are local involvement, the concerns are access, the concerns are making sure that our checklists are kept up to date and that people feel that when people move out of a community or pass on or die or move even within a community, that those addresses and names are managed in such a way that no inconsistencies occur with those addresses or names on election time. But those are the kinds of recommendations that this report is filled with. And I think as much to the recommendations, it's important for the findings to reveal why those recommendations came about. And I think that's an important section to review as well. And then lastly, I would encourage people to look at the exhibits of the summaries of the testimony. You also have access to 37 hours of hearings that you're more than welcome to take a dive into. These are all part and parcel of what was combined into this report.
I think when you look at the recommendations section, some of them say the Secretary of State should consider doing this. Some say the legislature should consider doing things. We stress a lot continuous training of local election officials. Obviously, the Secretary of State does it well. Other organizations do it. But then we talk about consideration of mandatory training or consideration of reporting people who don't get training. Consideration, we're not saying it's going to happen. We say it ought to be considered. Well, if it's going to be mandatory, the Secretary of State's not going to be able to do it. The legislature's going to have to do it. So they kind of go item by item. We find a lot of stuff is just taking the process and making it more of the same, only better. Recruiting more. Our election officials, like our society, are getting older. We need to recruit new people into the process. Well, that doesn't take legislation. That just takes continuous action by the Secretary of State's office, town officials, people talking about it. We talk about public officials casting a light on how people should have confidence in our elections and not tear them down. That doesn't take legislation. That doesn't take anything except common sense. We talk about more audits. Well, more audits may or may not need legislation. So when you look at them piece by piece, you figure out who has to do it.
I wanted to ask about consensus. That was something that was discussed in the process of trying to reach a consensus report. Could you talk about why that was a goal and just what it means now that obviously that has not been reached?
The reason it's a good thing is because if you have 8 people with various experiences who hear various things from the same people, it's probably better to see what everybody can come up with as an answer than what any individual comes up with as an answer. I'm not sure it hasn't been reached. Ken can speak for himself, but I think his view of how the report should be focused and what it ought to look like was different, but his efforts in organizing and reporting the testimony that we heard is a very, very valuable contribution to this report. And as he said during our meeting, he agrees with a lot of the report. I'm not going to put words in his mouth. But the fact that he thought that the report ought to go in a different direction doesn't mean that his input wasn't taken into consideration and isn't reflected in the report.
Can I say this? You know, writing a report by committee is an interesting process. You know, we had many hearings. I forget how many hours of hearings, but I think we had 5 meetings of about 3 hours each to write this report. So that's approximately 15 hours of word for word. There was a lot of give and take. There was a lot of, everybody didn't agree on every word, but there was a lot of attention that went into it. And I think, and I would echo what Chairman Cook said, I think there was a lot of opportunity for everyone to contribute. Ken did not sign off on the report, but there are a lot of his, he made many contributions and was an active member of the committee. And I think it was a lot of give and take, but I think the result speaks for itself.
Can I ask a question if you can? I was just curious about.
I'd like to make one comment first.
Get his microphone. Escapes the thing.
I think, first of all, that this is not a unanimous consent report. This is a significant supermajority report. And I think that means that there was a great deal of consensus among all of the participants on this. I think also, as Doug said, Ken's contribution was very significant, and then you can compare his notes as to what he proposed and to what was incorporated, and you will find that the majority of his suggestions were incorporated. So I think that a report that has been voted for by the committee 7-1 is nearly unanimous, and I think that's more to the point than any kind of divisions that one might want to pick. And I would leave that as the way that I hope that the public will receive the report as well.
I just wanted to ask Ken, one of the things that you mentioned during the committee sessions was, you know, folks who were testifying and saying that they had concerns, how would they take this report? Would they feel alienated by it? Could you just comment on the final product, how you think those people would feel about what this committee is presenting?
Were you here earlier?
Yes, it was.
That's my statement. And I say that because I've been misquoted all throughout this process. I agree with what was said today. I had a significant contribution into this report. And this is not about me. It's not about the fact that I didn't vote yes to sign it. I believe that there are other things that can and should go in the report. Those are my personal feelings. There's a couple things that I brought up in a couple meetings that I thought shouldn't be in the report. But as I said earlier, I think there's a lot of good work in the report, and I have nothing but respect for everyone involved in this process. And I want to leave it at that.
With regard to voting machines and compensation of local election officials, should the state have any role in that? In other words, should the state financially support cities and towns that want to upgrade their voting machines and/or pay their election officials more?
In the report, we make suggestions of this kind of funding being made available, but I think it's really up to the Secretary of State to answer that question, so I'll pass him the microphone.
We have a legislature that prepares a budget, and, that's really in their domain. I mean, currently, as far as voting machines go, the towns and the cities, in the first instance, decide whether or not they want to use a machine to count the ballots. And if they do decide, then they are the ones that absorb the cost of doing that.
We do say in the report, in kind of a catch-all recommendation, that if it costs money to make our elections more secure and our processes better, the legislature should appropriate the money. Breaking that down into who pays for the ballot counting devices, and we all know we're going to have new ones one of these days. We didn't think, I think, was our province, but obviously to the extent this stuff costs money and money would help make our democracy more secure and our elections more respected, they ought to spend the money.
This is a question for Mr. Eyring. You said you'll be releasing your own independent report. Could you describe a little bit of where you see your contributions will differ from that in contrast to what's currently been presented, given that you did contribute so much to this current report?
Well, like I said, today it's about this report, this committee, and honoring the Secretary of State for putting this together. I plan on giving a report to Secretary Scanlan sometime next week, and at that point you'll be able to read it and see where I differ. But as everybody has pointed out, there's a lot of things in this report that have my fingerprints on it. I agree with a lot of what's in it, and that's the story. The story is this committee came together. It worked and operated in an extremely respectful manner. Everybody listened to everybody else. And in the end, I just had to determine whether or not I wanted to endorse it. And like I said earlier to this lady over here, there's a few things that are in it that I didn't feel comfortable with, and there's a few things that are not in it, and I want to make them clear to the Secretary. I feel I have a personal obligation to meet my promise to Secretary Scanlan when he first described to me 7.5, 8 months ago what his mission is and what he expected from the committee, and I believe that there's more information that he should hear. What he does with that information is completely up to him. I served at the pleasure of the Secretary of State. I served honorably. I am very humbled to have been a part of this committee, to serve with all of these wonderful people.
And what were some of those things in this current report that you feel that was the word you said?
You can see my report next week. Okay, this is not about me. Shame on you if you try to make this about me. This is about the great work that this committee did. There are a lot of good things in there, and I think that should be the focus.
I think it should be clear that the exhibit to the report is as objective a summary as a subcommittee, which I am delighted not to have served on, could come up with. And it provides a summary of what the committee heard. There's a caveat at the beginning or a disclaimer that says just because we're including it in the summary doesn't mean we agree with it, doesn't mean we give it credence, but we wanted to report it because we thought as a group that it was worth providing the Secretary a summary. He was at most of the hearings, he heard most of the things, and I think he's heard them all before anyway. but to have them in black and white so that he can evaluate them and look at them, whether they were from people expressing confidence or not expressing confidence, provides him with all the information. I think unanimously think that's an important part of it. People should not read one of those things and say, oh, the committee agrees that somebody who said such and such was right, because we made it clear that we didn't think it was right or wrong, we just were reporting it. But that's an important part of the report. So as the fear of some is, people read reports but they don't read exhibits or they don't read appendices, read it all.
Yeah, I would just say I hope people focus on the recommendations in the report. I think that that's really the heart of it. And there's some very concrete things there. I mean, one that I think is very important is voter education about how elections work. And we talked about this being, from including the marketing campaign and the website, clarifying on websites, town websites, as well as education for the public. So I think that's a really important recommendation. Another thing that I think you'll see emphasized in the report was that we have local election officials who are locally elected, and we need to make sure we express our appreciation, but also they need to attend training, and some do and some don't. And how do we ensure more accountability for those folks? And also that people who want to, people have concerns. I mean, a lot of people brought concerns to this committee, and some of them were legitimate concerns, or most of them were legitimate concerns. We weren't an investigatory body, but they need to be referred to the Attorney General, and we emphasize the Attorney General needs to be timely and transparent in their in reporting back about what they see, so that people get responses in a timely manner, and it's open about what are some of the issues that people bring to their attention. So a lot of people did bring issues, and a lot of times we said, well, okay, that's a good question. It wasn't necessarily something we felt we could investigate, but there needs to be, we need to make sure that the process works, that people have means if they have concerns. I mean, people brought concerns, for example, about people voting in there who no longer live in their town. In some cases, people did their own investigations. And okay, give us the names, let's go forward, let's make sure that, let's find out what the problem was. Let's make sure there's a process to do that, so that when people do have these concerns, there's a way to get them resolved and there's a way for them to get answers. So those are some of the things in the recommendations that I think are important. And also just appreciating our local election officials, that it's not easy. And we want to make sure in this kind of environment that people, both our election officials and voters, are protected from any kind of harassment or any inappropriate kind of treatment. So those are just a few of the things that are in that recommendation section. Thank you.
I have a question for Secretary of State Scanlan. I know you're just receiving the report now, but you said none of this is a surprise to you. I'm curious if there are things that you're planning to prioritize from this report, or how you intend to use it moving forward.
I'm going to take the time to really review the report with members of my staff, take a look at the recommendations and prioritize them. There are some things that are currently underway. For example, the legislature is looking at different methods of post-election audits to verify the accuracy of ballot counting devices, and I expect that that's going to be a process that develops over time. The same thing is true with ballot counting devices, which are currently used, need to be replaced sometime in the not too distant future. We have companies that are actively presenting their ballot counting devices for trials in the upcoming municipal and state elections. We tested one that had open source software during the general election last year. And I think every time we do that, we're going to learn, but ultimately we'll make recommendations to the Ballot Law Commission, who's the only agency in New Hampshire that's authorized to approve a new ballot counting device. We recognize the need to train election officials, and so over the course of the last year, we've really ramped up the number and the type of trainings that we've been conducting. That's not something we need legislation for. However, if the policy is going to require that training be mandatory, that is something that would have to be passed by the legislature. And I think it's important to prioritize the other things in the report because there's only so much that we can do at a single given time. And we don't want to dilute ourselves too much by trying to address everything at once. I think we have to determine what the what the most important suggestions are, focus on those, get them done, and then progressively move forward.
I just wanted to add that we've talked about the need to continue the discussion of some of the ideas that came up as a part of this process and what might be considered by the legislature. I think any of you who've looked at the LSR list online will know that there will be many opportunities for further discussion. Pick a topic that was covered in the report and you probably see an LSR. So, more to come.
I think what we didn't say at the beginning, but the report says, is there will be people who urged us every day to recommend kind of wholesale changes in how New Hampshire conducts its elections and adopt certain procedures that we don't have. And there were people who will be disappointed in this report because we didn't slam certain things that they said were proof of trouble. And as has been said many times today, we weren't an investigatory body. So there'll be plenty of discussions to come by advocates for change in election process. That was outside of our scope. We were asked to look at why people should have confidence or didn't have confidence in the system that we have, not how do we reform the system. We did have a couple of comments in there about things that we heard often about confidence in elections. We heard often about gerrymandering, which wasn't really our province, but we have an item in there about the fact that we heard how there might be more confidence if there was a different way to design election districts. So we didn't do a lot of things. We didn't redesign the system. We examined the system. We didn't investigate specific alleged violations. We sent those to the Attorney General. But I think what we did do has a lot of substance to it, and as the Secretary said, gives them plenty to do.
And I will just add to what Brad just said and say that the overarching result of all of these hearings that took place over the last 6 months was that the majority of the New Hampshire public feels that our electoral system works and that it deserves support, and we need to keep a vigilant attention to all the details, because it's when we get lazy, it's when human error creeps in, it's when other bad influences can actually impact the process.
Just adding to that, I think when you look at this from 30,000 feet, I mean, we have a really good system here. And we're blessed in this state. I want to say we're lucky, but we're not just lucky, we've worked at it. We have a good election system, and when you see what happens in the other states, I mean, I think we can be proud and satisfied about what we have. Yet, at the same time, it's always subject to, there are errors, there are problems, it's a human endeavor, and it can always be improved. But we have a really strong, it's no accident we have the first in the nation primary here, because people know they can come here, the votes will be counted, and it'll be accurate, and it'll be well run. And I think that that's well established by any of the data that's available, and the people that came and testified before us. Yes, there are issues. It's a human endeavor. People make mistakes. And when people do make mistakes, there needs to be accountability. But I think we can be pretty proud of what we have in the state. I feel very blessed to live in New Hampshire.
Comment on that? If nothing else, thank you all for coming. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and we're done.
Yes.